In a shocking revelation that will leave fans stunned, the real reason behind the tension between Gary Burghoff and his co-stars has finally come to light. For years, whispers surrounded the actor's strained relationship with one of his most famous colleagues, but now the truth is being exposed. What we've learned will change everything you thought you knew about the dynamics behind the scenes. Prepare for the jaw-dropping truth that's been kept hidden for so long. Gary Burghoff was the heart of MASH, and not just because of his famous character, Radar O'Reilly. Radar was the kind of character you couldn't help but love. With his teddy bear, his big innocent eyes, and his soft-spoken manner, he brought a sense of warmth and tenderness to a show that was often full of sarcasm, dark humor, and the harsh realities of war. He was the glue that held the group together, the one who was always there to offer support, even if it was just in the form of a nervous smile or a simple, "Sir, I have a message." Fans adored him, and they loved Gary for bringing that character to life so effortlessly. But there was more to Gary than just Radar. Gary's portrayal of Radar made him an icon, and it wasn't just the character's sweetness that made him stand out. It was how he captured the essence of the role so perfectly. Radar was the innocent presence in the middle of the chaos of MASH, and Gary embodied that with a certain quiet grace. He made you feel for Radar's awkwardness, his vulnerability, and his loyalty to the men around him. He wasn't the loudest or most obvious character, but he was the one who made you feel the emotions the most. He played Radar with a deep sense of sincerity, and that made all the difference. But what fans didn't see was the person behind the character. For years, Gary was the face of MASH, and while his character was beloved, the man behind Radar wasn't always as adored. Off camera, Gary wasn't always the easygoing, lovable figure that his character portrayed. His role on the show was demanding, both in terms of the work and the personal toll it took on him. Gary often had to carry the weight of playing such a deeply emotional character, and sometimes that pressure became too much. Despite his success, behind the scenes, Gary's time on MASH wasn't as carefree as it appeared. He was often seen as the quiet, humble actor who let his character shine, but Gary wasn't always as comfortable with the fame that came with it. While his portrayal of Radar made him an iconic character in television history, it also left him feeling somewhat trapped by the role. He was always associated with Radar, and as time went on, it became harder for him to separate himself from that character. Gary wasn't just Radar to his fans, he was Radar to the entire world. While the show's success brought him fame, it also came with the emotional weight of always being in the public eye. This constant exposure began to take a toll on Gary, and the lines between his personal life and his role as Radar started to blur. For years, Gary played Radar with the kind of dedication that only a true artist could bring to the table. But when he left MASH, it wasn't just the end of his time on the show. It was the beginning of a personal journey. He left behind the fame, the recognition, and the character that had made him a household name. It wasn't just a career decision. It was a personal one too. Gary had given so much of himself to Radar, and by the time he decided to leave, he needed to reclaim something for himself. His departure marked the end of an era for MASH, but it also represented Gary's desire to find peace in his own life, away from the spotlight that had followed him for so long. Behind the scenes of MASH, a show that many fans consider one of the greatest sitcoms ever made, there were tensions and strained relationships that were kept hidden from the public. While the show's portrayal of camaraderie among the staff at the 4777th Mass Unit made it seem like one big happy family, the reality was far from it. The pressure of working on a hit show, the long hours, and the emotionally taxing material they dealt with took a toll on the cast and crew. Gary Burghoff, who played Radar O'Reilly, was no exception. While his character was beloved by fans and the other characters on the show, the actor behind Radar had a more complicated relationship with some of his co-stars. One of the most talked about tensions on set was Gary's relationship with his fellow cast members, particularly with one actor who seemed to have a difficult time getting along with him. MASH was a tightly knit ensemble show, with each actor contributing their own unique energy to the series. However, there were some personalities on set that just didn't mesh well. Gary was known for his quiet, reserved nature, while other cast members like Alan Alda, who played Hawkeye Pierce, were much more outspoken and eager to push boundaries. It's easy to see how these different personalities could clash, especially when they spent so much time working together in a high-pressure environment. One of the actors who reportedly had a strained relationship with Gary was Mike Farrell, who played BJ Honeycutt. While Farrell wasn't the only one to have a difficult time with Gary, his relationship with the actor was often cited as being a bit tense. According to some reports, Gary could be difficult to work with at times, and his reserved nature sometimes made him seem standoffish. This led to a lack of communication and misunderstandings between him and his co-stars. Interestingly, while Gary was a beloved character on the show, he wasn't always the easiest to get along with behind the scenes. There were reports of Gary being difficult to approach, often keeping to himself and not engaging as much with the rest of the cast. This was particularly evident when the cast would have off time between takes or during breaks in filming. While others would engage in conversations or hang out together, Gary often preferred to keep to himself. This dynamic created a divide between him and his fellow actors. In interviews, some of the cast members admitted that they didn't always see eye to eye with Gary. While they respected his work as Radar, there were times when his behavior behind the scenes made the working environment a bit tense. It wasn't just about the acting, it was about the personalities that clashed when the cameras stopped rolling. The biggest issue, however, was Gary's relationship with one particular actor, who had a far more personal issue with him. The actor in question was none other than Mass Colonel Henry Blake, played by McLean Stevenson. Stevenson was known for his easygoing demeanor and was considered one of the most well-liked actors on the set, but his relationship with Gary was far from perfect. According to Stevenson himself, there were tensions between him and Gary that were hard to overlook. Stevenson admitted that he had a somewhat complicated relationship with Gary. While he respected him as an actor, there were moments when they just couldn't seem to get along. This wasn't just a one-time occurrence, it was an ongoing issue that Stevenson said stemmed from personality differences and conflicting ideas about how to approach their roles. Stevenson was often the center of attention on set, especially as Colonel Blake, and his easygoing nature didn't always mesh well with Gary's more serious, reserved persona. In some ways, the tension between Gary and Stevenson was the result of their different approaches to the work. Stevenson, who had a more relaxed attitude, was able to joke around with the rest of the cast, while Gary, more focused and sometimes intense, would often stay quiet. This divide led to misunderstandings and, eventually, to Stevenson's departure from the show. Stevenson's exit from MASH was a surprise to many, as his character was one of the most loved on the show. Fans were shocked when his Colonel Blake character was killed off in such a dramatic and unexpected way. But what the fans didn't know was that there were personal and professional reasons behind his departure. Stevenson admitted that part of the reason he left was the growing tension on set, particularly his strained relationship with Gary. The tensions behind the scenes weren't limited to just Gary and his fellow actors, though. As the show progressed, MASH became a larger and more complex production, and with that came its own set of challenges. The cast had to deal with the pressure of maintaining the show's high standards, dealing with the ever-growing expectations of the audience, and managing their personal lives. All of this stress started to take a toll on the actors, and some of them began to feel isolated from one another. Gary, despite being a key part of the show's success, found himself becoming increasingly frustrated with his situation. He wasn't always the best at communicating his frustrations and often kept them to himself, leading to misunderstandings with his fellow cast members. This led to a sense of alienation for Gary, who began to feel like an outsider within the ensemble that had once been so close-knit. By the time Gary left the show in Season 7, things had become so tense on set that even the other actors noticed a shift. Some of them saw it coming, but they didn't know how to address it. Gary's departure was seen as a quiet retreat from the tension that had built up over the years. While MASH continued to be successful without him, his absence was felt by the cast and the audience alike. What made this situation even more complex was the fact that Gary's departure wasn't just about the tension on set, it was also about his personal life. He had been dealing with a number of personal challenges during his time on the show, including a difficult marriage and the pressures of being in the public eye. These issues, combined with the growing tensions on set, led Gary to make the decision to leave the show and focus on his personal well-being. While MASH continued without him, the legacy of Radar and the impact that Gary had on the show remained. His departure marked the end of an era for the show, and the behind-the-scenes drama only made the show's legacy more intriguing. It showed that even the most beloved shows, with their carefully constructed characters and storylines, were not without their own challenges. The tension, the personal struggles, and the complex relationships all contributed to the show's ultimate success, but they also revealed the human side of the actors behind the scenes. In the end, Gary's departure was a bittersweet moment for MASH. While his character was one of the most iconic in television history, the tensions that led to his exit were a reminder that the world of entertainment is not always as harmonious as it seems. The behind-the-scenes struggles and relationships shaped the show as much as the on-screen performances, and they played a crucial role in the show's legacy. Gary Burghoff's departure from MASH remains one of the most talked about events in the history of the show, and it wasn't just about the loss of his beloved character Radar O'Reilly. The circumstances surrounding Gary's exit were layered with personal, professional, and emotional factors that were not immediately apparent to the audience. While MASH fans around the world were devastated by Radar's departure, the story behind Gary's decision to leave the show is one that reflects a combination of tensions, frustrations, and a growing need for personal space. When MASH first premiered in 1972, Gary Burghoff's portrayal of Radar was one of the key elements that made the show so unique. His character, the shy, innocent, and often overly earnest company clerk, was a fan favorite. Radar's endearing qualities balanced out the sarcasm and darker aspects of the other characters, and his relationship with Colonel Blake, played by McLean Stevenson, was central to the show's heart. It wasn't just Radar's sweetness that made him memorable, but also the charm Gary brought to the role. However, despite the adoration he received from fans and the clear connection Radar had with the audience, Gary's time on MASH wasn't as fulfilling behind the scenes. Gary had a deep love for acting, but as time went on, he started to feel the weight of his fame and the constraints of being so tightly associated with Radar. The character had become a symbol of innocence, and while fans loved him, Gary began to feel pigeonholed. He was typecast as the kind, soft-spoken Radar, but he knew there was so much more to him as an actor. He began to feel trapped, unable to explore the full range of his abilities. On set, Gary's demeanor had also started to shift. He wasn't the only one on set with struggles. MASH was known for its long hours, difficult material, and the occasional interpersonal conflict between the cast members. The show's intense subject matter and the constant pressures of being in the public eye contributed to the tension that was building behind the scenes. While the audience only saw the friendships and camaraderie between characters, behind the scenes, things were far less harmonious. Gary's decision to leave MASH came at a time when he felt more disconnected from his role and the direction the show was going. There were tensions between him and other cast members, especially with the increasingly dominant presence of Alan Alda, who had become the show's lead. Alda's character, Hawkeye Pierce, was always at the forefront of the show's dramatic and comedic moments, and as the series progressed, Alda's influence on the show grew. Gary, who had always been a part of the ensemble, began to feel more isolated as the storylines became increasingly centered around Hawkeye and his relationships with the other characters. Despite the tensions, Gary remained professional and kept his focus on doing his job, but it was clear that his personal life was starting to take a toll on him. His marriage was in trouble, and he was struggling with the pressures of fame. He didn't want to just be known as Radar O'Reilly forever, but he was finding it hard to escape the shadow of the character. Gary had always been a private person, and as his fame grew, he realized that he no longer had control over his own life. Everywhere he went, fans recognized him, and it became difficult to have any semblance of a private life. He was a father by this time, and his family began to feel the impact of his fame as well. Gary wanted to be a good father, but being Radar meant that he was often unavailable to his children. The decision to leave MASH wasn't an easy one for Gary. In fact, he admitted later that it was one of the hardest decisions he ever made. He knew that leaving the show meant leaving behind a role that had made him famous and beloved by millions. But he also knew that staying on the show was making him miserable, and it wasn't the kind of environment where he could continue to grow as an actor or as a person. Gary's decision to leave came in Season 7, and while his character's departure was written into a two-part episode titled Goodbye Radar, the truth was that Gary had already made up his mind long before the episode aired. His decision was rooted in a need to focus on his personal life and to take a step away from the pressures of fame. When Gary's departure was announced, it shocked both the cast and the audience. Radar's departure was handled in a way that was both emotional and poignant. In the episode, Radar says goodbye to his friends at the 4077th and leaves to return home. The scene in which Radar leaves is one of the most memorable in the history of television, with Gary's real emotions spilling over into his performance. It's a moment that encapsulated not only the end of Radar's journey, but also the end of an era for MASH. Gary's departure marked a significant turning point for the show, and many fans felt that the heart of the show had left along with him. What fans didn't know at the time was that Gary's exit wasn't just about the character. Behind the scenes, Gary was dealing with a host of personal and professional issues that made it clear that his time on MASH was coming to an end. His decision to leave was, in many ways, a culmination of all the pressures he had been facing for years. He needed to step away from the show to focus on his family and his own mental well-being. Gary himself has said that his decision to leave was not about resentment toward the show or his co-stars, but about needing a change. He was ready to leave Radar behind and find a new direction for his career. In the years that followed his departure from MASH, Gary did some acting but mostly kept a low profile. He was known to avoid the limelight, preferring to live a quieter life away from the pressures of fame. He never regretted his decision to leave MASH, even though it was a difficult choice. Gary later revealed that while the show had been an important part of his life, the character of Radar had become more of a burden than a joy. He was grateful for the role, but knew that in order to move forward, he had to let go of it. Gary's departure from MASH was a bittersweet moment for fans, but it also served as a reminder of the toll that fame and the pressures of working on a hit show can have on a person. Behind the scenes, the cast and crew of MASH dealt with tensions, creative differences, and personal struggles that weren't always visible to the audience. Gary Burghoff's exit was a turning point for the show and for him personally. It marked the end of one chapter in his life and the beginning of another, one where he could focus on what mattered most to him, his family, and his well-being. While MASH continued to be successful after Gary left, his departure marked the end of an era. Radar, with his sweet smile and gentle demeanor, was a character that fans could never forget. But the actor behind that character, Gary Burghoff, needed to step away in order to find peace and pursue a life outside the spotlight. His decision to leave the show was a difficult but necessary one, and it ultimately allowed him to live a life that was more fulfilling and true to his personal values. Gary Burghoff's journey with fame, especially due to his iconic role as Radar O'Reilly on MASH, was one that transformed his life in ways he never fully anticipated. In the early days of his career, Burghoff was like many young actors, hoping to make a name for himself in a challenging industry. But when MASH hit the airwaves, it didn't just change his career. It changed his life in ways that were both exhilarating and, at times, suffocating. Gary's portrayal of Radar O'Reilly, the sweet and innocent company clerk, quickly became a fan favorite. Radar's role in the series was significant, providing emotional depth in the chaotic environment of the 47th 77th MASH unit. His character was known for his loyalty, his soft-spoken nature, and his iconic teddy bear, which became a symbol of comfort and innocence. On-screen, Radar seemed to bring light into the darkest moments of the show, offering a sense of hope amidst the madness of war. Fans adored him, and in many ways the character made Gary a household name. However, being part of such a groundbreaking show had consequences that Gary had not anticipated. As MASH grew in popularity, so did Gary's fame. His face was known across the country, and the world of MASH seemed to expand beyond just the television set. Radar wasn't just a character in a sitcom, he became a symbol of kindness and purity in the midst of chaos, a symbol that many people connected with on a deep level. This adoration from fans felt rewarding in the beginning, but over time it became overwhelming. Gary started to feel the pressure of living up to the character's idealized image. At first, Gary handled the fame with grace. He appreciated the recognition, and it was clear that he loved being part of a show that had such a deep cultural impact. He enjoyed connecting with fans and being part of something that people looked forward to each week. But as the years went on, the toll of fame started to wear on him. While Radar's warmth and innocence were adored on-screen, the fame that came with it began to feel like a burden off-screen. Everywhere Gary went, he was recognized. Fans would approach him in public, asking for autographs, photos, and even sharing how much they loved the character of Radar. At first, it felt like a compliment, but over time, it began to invade every aspect of his personal life. Gary found it increasingly difficult to enjoy simple moments with his family. When he went out for a walk with his children, he couldn't escape the constant attention. Instead of just being a father with his kids, he became Radar for the public. And that constant visibility made it hard for him to experience the peace and joy that should come with family life. Every time they stepped outside, there was the pressure of being watched, and it wasn't just a few moments here and there. It was constant. That constant reminder that he was never truly alone, even in his private moments, started to erode Gary's sense of peace. His children didn't just have a father, they had a father who was Radar. And Gary realized that they didn't get to experience the normal, quiet family life that he wanted to give them. As Gary became more aware of the overwhelming nature of his fame, he began to feel disconnected from the person he had been before MASH. He didn't want to be Radar all the time, but the more popular the show became, the harder it was for him to escape that role. Fame became a weight, one that slowly started to suffocate him. Even when he tried to live a quiet life, the shadow of Radar was always present. People would approach him in public, calling him Radar, and it was as if they didn't see Gary Burghoff at all, just the character he had played. This emotional and mental toll reached a peak as Gary's personal life began to unravel. At the height of MASH's success, Gary was also struggling with his marriage. His relationship with Fame was taking a toll on his marriage, and as the pressures of being Radar weighed more heavily on him, his personal life began to feel increasingly unmanageable. The very thing that had brought him success, his fame, was also the thing that was pulling him away from the things that mattered most in his life, like his family.